Well, thank you, Sir Walter. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna, as we all know, current society right now, this day, this hour, is severely divided by all kinds of categories and identities. And but if we look at the divisions, we can identify the basic four, which are gender, class, age, and what I call race identity, but I also include in the racial identity ethnicity because they function very similarly, although racism is much more severe than ethnic discrimination, but they function along the same lines. In fact, before I start talking about origins of these divisions, I just want to say that they do share something in common so that this explains why we can analyze them all together. One of the things that they share in common is that in these hierarchies of power, I call them hierarchies of power because they're structured hierarchically with people up at the top and at the bottom and classes or groups in the middle. And so it's not just duality, but they're hierarchies. And what they have in common is that people are branded with social identities. And these social identities are used as categories to assign value to people in society. So whether you're male or female, that's a brand that you cannot escape. If any racial identity, age, etc. So the branding is almost inescapable. For example, let me just give you a quick more than any man could have done. Someone would come up and say, well, you're still a woman. The one case I saw in which, well, one of the things that another principle of these hierarchies is that they're someone oppressed in one hierarchy could be an oppressor in another hierarchy. For example, I had a friend of mine who is a scholar in sociology, and he was telling me about the story in which he went to the opera in Washington, D.C. And next to him was sitting a very nice, gentle, elderly white woman, and they were having a great conversation. He's Afro Latino. He's from Puerto Rico, but he's a major sociologist. And they're having a really great conversation. And then, so you're thinking, okay, here's a male, female, all right? And here's white and colored. But in walks Condoleezza Rice and sits across from them in the opera hall. And the little lady, the nice little lady, whether she meant it or not, she blurted out, she's still an N person. She's still an N person. And so no matter, Condoleezza Rice was the most powerful woman on earth next to the president of the United States. And here this woman is saying she's still an N person. So she's used, even though they're both women, she's using racial identity as a way of establishing her superiority. And so branding is something that's there, and it's very hard to overcome. Secondly, these identities, these social identities are enforced by or kept in line by different kinds of forces. It could be physical. For example, we know that there's a lot of domestic violence against women. We know there's violence against children. We know there's violence against people of different races or ethnicities. We know that violence is there, but that's not the only way that you can control someone or oppress someone. You can use economic violence. If someone has no option but to submit in order to live, to get the bread and water for their lives, then what happens is that you've been controlled economically. There's no, the most important example of this is women who have to stay at home and take care of the children and have no option but to submit to male authority. And resistance is always, and of course, political violence is there. I mean, the law is the law. So if the law can be enforced by the police or the courts, then your status is verified again and you can't escape the status assigned to you. Another thing is that resistance is always there. It never goes away, although there are people who just give in and say, I can't do anything about this. Resistance is futile, but resistance is always underneath the surface. And what's happening today, right now, is that the gradual process of the democratic idea in American society has progressed to a point where uh, in the more traditional roles of male, female, adult to child, etc., that they have dissolved because people are claiming freedom for themselves in all of these hierarchies of power. So there's conflict right now in society. There's a women's movement, there's a Me Too movement, there's a youth movement, you name it, there's some sort of movement. And so what happens, however, is that because people take on a primary identity. Okay, for example, I'm African American. Okay, that's my primary identity. Or I'm a female. That's my primary identity. Or where do I feel the most oppression and I need to liberate myself? So people get divided by these differences and they don't see that they're being oppressed or that they have challenges a whole of the whole spectrum or that they're privileged by the whole spectrum. So my point of view here is that um, the traditional historiography and other literature, sociology, et cetera, usually focuses on only one variable and focuses really insightfully on the role of that one variable. And sometimes they go into two, occasionally they go into three, but nobody ever really looks at the big picture of why society is structured that way. We take it for granted. And so we fight each individual battles. And one of the things that happens is that because women in the women's movement, the Me Too movement, the youth movement, the Latino movement, any movement at all, the workers movement, what happens is that they are therefore divided. One idea, and so they are to conflict with each other. Workers versus women versus African Americans. You know, why are you paying attention to them when we're oppressed? You know, we need liberation here, or they never. And what happens is that the efforts to liberate themselves are disunited. They're fragmented. They're fragmented. And what's needed to really reform society as a whole is to address the whole structure of society and attack all of the inequalities, all of the hierarchies of power at the same time together. And this can only happen if the public, the common man, if you will, or anyone who sympathizes with these, I would call them movements of human equality. I mean, we're all humans and we're only trying to establish our equality before the law and for society. Equality means respect. It doesn't mean communism or equality of perfect. You can't say that men and women are exactly the same, but they have equal rights. They should have equal rights. They should have equal pay. They should be rewarded by their merit. Hierarchies of power are not based on merit. They're based on assigned identities that are used to exploit the people that are negatively assigned and to privilege the people that are positively assigned here. And so we need to, ultimately, the solution to these various discriminations or prejudices is for human beings to unite, assert their common human identity and work together. Why can't we get along together? Okay, so how did this come about? Because very few studies actually look at the origins of inequality. To them, it just happens, and then they study the phenomena, they explain it, they explain resistance and identities, but they never look at what is the origins of human inequality in human societies. And I've looked at human societies in terms of civilizations and pre-civilization. And I found that there are common patterns in all civilizations. I have a theory about what forces create civilizations. This study or this presentation is only one part of that. I'm not going to get into the larger view because that's a whole different topic. But how did these inequalities arise? Well, how did humans begin? We began as living from nature, directly from nature, in groups of hunters and gatherers and small bands of 50 to maybe 150. And because we were involved in an enterprise of survival and we did not have modern technologies, we had to figure out how to live directly from the earth. And therefore, especially because we were organized into small bands, we had to cooperate. There was no option. And so under these conditions, merit or leadership or prestige had to be earned not by appropriating wealth and controlling others, but by serving the common good. The common good is a beautiful idea that has lived on through history, but we rarely think of the common good. Robert Reich just wrote a book on the common good in modern politics. But the common good is the well, instead of the idea is that your security, your identity, your place in society is based on you contributing to others, not being selfish. And so what happens is that survival in the wilderness and the need to cooperate led to the tampering down of tendencies in the human personality that lead to hierarchies of power. And so, but what happens is that how then out of that hunting and gathering stage of relatively democracy, there were inequalities there too. I mean, it's not like they're idealized. Men were beating up on women, people were being ambitious, but again, they had to serve the common good. If you did not serve the common good, you could get exiled or killed or just, ignored. And so there were social controls within a small society and with nature. So how did civilization arise? Now, the hierarchies of power that I'm talking about today are a key characteristic of civilization. There's no civilization that has ever existed that has not had hierarchies of power, primarily male and female. The youth thing, the class thing is central to hierarchies of power. And then the identification of other peoples who you can exploit one way or another. And so how does this come about? Well, it depends on the availability of how much wealth there is that's accessible to people within a society. Hierarchies of power in pre-civilization structures where there's a lot of salmon, a lot of deer to hunt, a lot of buffalo, where nature gives you so much resources that you have an abundance of resources. And if you can preserve them over the year through drying out process or whatever, or trade, that is a capital. That is capital. That is something that you can use to gain something else. And what happens is that once that wealth is available, there are some people who are innately greedy. They're born that way. It's just, like if you look at the humanity, we're all born in one point in a spectrum. For example, I divide human beings into various spectrums. You have to think of spectrums of personalities and drives. For example, there are extreme givers in society. There are extreme takers. These people are born that way. They're genetically programmed to be extreme givers and takers. And most of us are in the middle. We both take and give, and we try to be reasonable. But when you have an extreme giver, they'll give you the shirt off their back no matter what. And excuse me, I thought I'd shut this down. Oh, I thought I silenced it, but anyway. So what happens is that you have extreme givers that are born genetically or takers, and they immediately try to seize the surplus wealth because now sort of society can still survive in spite of the fact that they have control of the wealth. And then what happens after that is that culture does play a role. Once you have an extreme taker taking a position of supremacy over others in society because of their accumulation of wealth, then they can train their children to be extreme takers. And so now you have lineages that appear in human society, lineages of privilege and lineages that are exploited by the lineages of privilege. And so this is how this thing comes about. In fact, if you look at modern racism, it really begins with the idea that one lineage is genetically superior to another or culturally superior to another. So these are the origins of inequality. And as you get more wealth, for example, civilization really takes off throughout the globe when agriculture appears. And agriculture is like the equivalent of discovering an incredible amount of wealth in the ground. It's like finding oil. It's the equivalent of oil. It's a capital. So agriculture, the capital in agriculture was the grain, food. And so food was used to control other people. Now, how do you get that? Well, the extreme takers managed to get a hold of, they invented something that we now call private property. private property did not exist in the hunting gathering stage. It was communal property. But they invented the idea of private property and then got everybody else to buy in it. And then they took control of most of the land. And so now, instead of sharing the land and everybody being independent, I control the land. You work for me. I feed you. And by the way, we got so much food around that, you know what? I need a mansion built. Could you guys build me a mansion? Oh, wow. The reason I'm so rich is that God says I'm rich. If God did not favor me and my lineage, he wouldn't give me this wealth. He wouldn't give me this power. So let's build me a pyramid. And then it goes on. Eventually what happens is that those who control the wealth, they gain power of society through ideological and physical force and legal forces. They create something that I call the predatory state, which is the government that is used to exploit the commoners. And what they do is that, okay, how are we going to use our wealth and how do we get more wealthy? Well, it doesn't pay to have everybody dispersed across a large region of the earth or even farmland. We need their labor, both intellectual and manual, right here, concentrated in a town and then eventually a city. And so cities are central to civilization, but cities now have to be organized into hierarchical structures. The main one that we think about is class. So, okay, you have what I would call the metaphoric 1%, because sometimes they're 10% or 50%, but they rule, or they could be just 1%, and then the rest of us who work for them. The class structure is not just the 1% and the 99%. It's not a big gap. It is a structure system in which the people that are most rewarded in this class structure are the intellectuals, the inventors of new technologies, the managers who control society, who manage it for the wealthy, and who create the systems for using armies of all kinds, whether it's workers' armies or fighting armies, etc. And so the intellectuals get the most reward and they buy into the system because they're highly privileged. They're just right underneath the top beneficiaries. And then below the intellectuals, you get a quasi-intellectual class that is manual. These are the skilled workers. You have to have training, you have to have experience to do something specific in society with your hands, and you have to think about it. And so you have the elite that controls the capital, the managers of the capital in the system, then the skilled workers, and then below you have the drones, people who you might have 100 Einsteins working for you, but they're not, because they're branded as by their social identity and condition as drones. They cannot exercise their brilliance to contribute or change society. They have to play a drone part. And in many societies, there's a fifth class, and that is formal slaves. That, okay, hey, we captured those people, they owe us something, let's make them into slaves, or we turn our own people into slaves. So this is the way that structures occur. So let me now talk about how these structures are interrelated. In the flyer that we composed and went out, I combined the 5 hierarchies of power so that you can actually measure what your individual social position is in society based on where you rank in these hierarchies of power. For example, male and female. So if you're a male, normally you are considered superior to a female. Now, again, all of these hierarchies are in stress, in I would call code red, because of the challenges. The Me Too movement and the women's movement and the legal system has come to a place where women are not as oppressed as before, but they are still not there. And if you just look at the history, the political history, we still have not had a woman president. Most of the politicians are still male. Most corporate positions are still male. You go through society, it's still this, and of course, the economic compensation for females is a lot less, although better than before. And so you have the gender structure, and then you have Let's talk about the most important one, because very often race is, or slavery is called America's original sin. And so people think, oh, slavery was America's original sin. That's the only sin around. No, no, that's slavery is an original sin, but there's four others. And it all has to do with the exercise of power by a few over the many, and the exploitation of the many, and the denial of the humanity of the many. And so, and that hurts society, because just think, if you had liberated the 100 Einsteins that are being used as drones and had them contribute to society, wouldn't we all be much better? So what happens is that power creates wealth for some and poverty for others, but it hurts society because society doesn't grow. Society is stunted by the inability of the drones to give their full creativity to the larger common good. So race, yes, that is a powerful hierarchy of power, but ethnicity has functioned very similarly to race. And the part about race is that uh, when you talk about racialization, and you're usually talking about white, black, the color of the skin is impossible to change. And so people are identified like that, and there may be mulattoes in society. In Latin America, we had a range of colors, but in America, if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. You can't escape that. That's the branding system. You are branded as something, and you can't escape. Now, I don't want to think that I'm equating all the hierarchies of power, and that, for example, oh, someone's going to say, well, wait a minute, the brutality of race makes it the original sin because no suffered the lynchings and the demeaning uh, uh, treatment, and still, and the lack of, and the robbing of wealth. I mean, African Americans are by and large poor because they've been robbed of the access to their wealth, and when they got some wealth, it's been taken away from them. But you're still talking, for example, this comparison may be a little bit, it's not strange. Let's say, for example, we're talking about apples, oranges, pears, and watermelons. Okay, so say, how can you compare those? Well, they're all fruit. They're all fruit, and when we eat them all, and so they have something in common. And so these hierarchies of power have something in common that I said before: the branding, the social identities, the multiple types of force. And so there are different types of force that can be used in each hierarchy. For example, women uh, have had legal status historically in society that just legally makes them inferior beings. Women in the United States did not get the vote until 1920. We got our liberty way back then. I'm seeing where I've got maybe 15 minutes left, or less. So I'm going to try to get through fast to these hierarchies. So there's different ways of enforcing them. So, for example, domestic violence is still rampant in society. Violence against children is rampant. There's the global trade in women and children, and even men. So you have these forms of slavery. So it's not just the racialization. Racialization is really, here's something that they all have in common. Another thing, each hierarchy of power is justified by the oppressors with what I call a conquest ideology. A conquest ideology just simply says that this person is inferior because of this. So, and they all have an incredible amount in common. For example, in terms of race, women, children, etc., class, the people occupying superior position think, okay, those people below us are mentally inferior. Those people below us cannot control their emotions. Those people below us are lazy. Those people below us are dangerous. Those people below us just are not suited to govern or to lead society. We, the privileged, are going to do that for them. And in fact, we're doing them a favor by governing. We're doing them a favor by, for example, the classic example is take the male and female. Okay, well, she's my wife. Yes, I am the head of the family. Yes, she is submissive to me. But you know what? I protect her. I give her an income. I feed her. So it's like the Lord over the peasant saying, okay, you owe me tribute, but I'm protecting you from the other predators. And so all of these hierarchies have the same conquest ideology justifying them, except it's adjusted to that. Um, and let me see if I need to go over specifics with each one. Oh, let me talk about the fifth hierarchy of power, and then I'll open up the questions and then see what, where we can go from there, because I don't want to just dominate the conversation. The fifth hierarchy of power is any characteristic that will help you dominate someone if the other four are insufficient. So for example, if you have a rich white male Christian and they're upper class, etc. But so how can men differentiate between each other and establish hierarchy of power? Well, for example, Protestants over Catholics, or Catholics over Protestants. Or Donald Trump gave us a perfect example early on in his presidential or candidate career when he picked out a reporter in the audience and said, ridiculed someone who had a physical disability. And so in fact, you don't want to set up physical characteristics as a major category, because it's just too, it's not enough to cover that big. But for example, look at the role of that beauty plays in American society. Look at the advantage that women have gained in sports broadcasting in the United States, where now every football game, where before they said, no, women don't belong here, they can't handle it, etc. Now, in most of the sports broadcasts for the NFL, you have a woman, and yet, so you're able to succeed that. But what kind of women have achieved that status? Number one, they have to be really confident and good at their sports analysis. That's number one. You don't see any women appearing in these sports places, programs, that don't know their stuff. They're equal to the men. But what's the other characteristic of the women that have succeeded? They're all physically attractive. They're all physically beautiful. And they're all elegant, etc. So you're ever going to see a woman who's not that physically attractive? It's maybe, because of the talent, but these are the things that the fifth category is. For example, in Germany, where the German government turned against the Jews and not identified them as the enemy. Well, the Jews had already integrated themselves into German society so thoroughly that it was hard to separate Germans from Jews. And so you had to put a yellow star on the Jew to make sure that you could identify them. So it's another form of branding. So those are, and just you go through society, any type of different characteristics that you can use to put someone in an inferior position, that is what happens. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to take up the whole hour, and see if anybody's got any questions. And if nobody's got any questions, then I'll go back and explain my theory even more fully.
Those people who have questions could use the reaction button. I think it's the rightmost one, and then they can raise their hands, and Jackie will identify them.
Yeah, it's got a little smiley face on there with a
Yes.
plus.
But if there are no questions, then we could allow Professor Cuello to have the final say.
Okay, yeah. One of the things that I put at the end of the advertising is that this is part of a larger theory of the rise and fall of civilizations. And what I've done is, because my own basic identity is human, here's another solution to the problem of hierarchy. If you ask people, what is your identity? And I've done this in classes, for example, someone will say, well, I'm a student. Or another person will say, well, I'm a mom. Another person will say, I'm an accountant. Another person will say, I'm gay. Another person will say, I'm Mexican. Another person will, and what I tell them is that Yes, that is true. That is your identity, but that should not be your primary identity because now you are dividing yourself from the rest of the world by that specific identity. Keep it, but your first identity should be human. And why should your first identity be human? Because if you're human and you admit that everybody else in existence is human, then the tendency will be that you will not take disrespect against you because I'm fully human like you are, and you cannot abuse me. I have a right to be to my human rights. And then conversely, your tendency will be not to prejudge other people as less than human or less than you because they are fully human too. So you have to deliver respect whether you like them or not. And you have to, and again, the biggest human problem that we have today are the social divisions created by civilization. And it's very hard to come together because of these divisions. You're a man, I'm a woman, I'm poor, you're rich, blah, blah, blah. And so we see these divisions and we can never get together enough to solve the problem. For example, one of the things that the well-to-do, the people who control society do is they use these divisions to control us. For example, the black and white issue, man, there are poor whites suffering in this country under class oppression that if they're not at the same level as African Americans, they can be pretty close to it. And there are illegalized Mexicans working here that are oppressed, but each of these groups thinks of the other as the enemy. White workers think, oh, the Mexicans are coming to take my job, and the blacks. And so the idea is that the enemy is not the rich, the enemy is another human being that is competing with me for that job. Well, if you look at, if you go on YouTube and you look up Inequality of Wealth, there's a little video, it's about 8 minutes long, and it shows you how in the last 40 years, the inequality of wealth has skyrocketed in the United States, where most of the wealth has gone to the super rich, where you can't even graph the utmost limit of what the 1% and 1/10 of 1% have. Whereas below, all of us are being crushed. And this crushing of the social structure, of the economic social structure, is happening at all levels. It's not just the poor that are being crushed. It's not just the working class that are being crushed. The skilled workers, the tradesmen are being crushed, but guess what? The middle class is being crushed, and guess even more, people in very high positions where they're well paid, rich bankers, etc. If they're vice presidents or they work for somebody, they too are being crushed because now I know, for example, a bank vice president that used to have two co-workers doing the job with her, and now that job belongs only to her, and she's got to do the work of three people instead of one. And so you have these inequalities. My theory about civilization, and I'll just close with this, is that the greedy 1% that I call unleashed individuals, because they unleash themselves from the responsibility to the common good and serve only their selfishness. Unleashed individuals created 4 other forces that have allowed them to create civilization and control them. One is the predatory state, that is government that is used to govern people and force them into compliance. Another one is conquest ideology, these are ideologies that say that I have the right to exploit someone because it's good for them and it's good for everybody else. Another one is liberated capitalism, which is really greed unleashed to an extent that's unimaginable sometimes. And so that greed feeds this search for power. And the fifth one, which we all know now, we're paying a very high price, is misapplied technology. Technology throughout human history has been invented for the benefit of civilization, of the 1%, of creating more wealth at the bottom to create more people to exploit. But technology has stripped the earth of its natural habitat, of its natural environment. Just think of this. What does civilization give back to nature? What does it take from nature, and what does it give back to nature? Civilization takes all the energy of the land, water, and sea to be civilization. And what does it give back? Garbage and sewage. We're turning the earth into a garbage heap. So, and that's why we all have to get together to solve these issues, recognize that we're all in the same boat. And I'm not saying, sometimes I feel like, man, we ought to hang the 1%, but the 1% are part of us. And we have to reintegrate them into humanity and teach them how to better behave. They're wild children going astray. Thank you. Well, we could take off early, Walter. I did tell my friends that, that this session would be taped and that they could, view it later on, and maybe we can give them the directions to where they can find it.
Okay. Yes. Dr. Edwards, you had something.
It was just that Professor Cuello gave us so much to think about, that to digest, and his presentation covered so many areas that no questions were available.
Sometimes I can be overwhelming.
Have to thank you for the talk, and ask Jackie to give her closing little spiel.
Okay, good.
Yes, thank you so much for that very insightful talk. And yes, this it will be recorded and available on our YouTube shortly. I will send the link to you, Dr. Cuello, and so we can we'll probably have that to you by the end of the week. And as for the rest of you, you can refer to our website for previous talks, for past talks. And just thank you again. And the Humanities Center, I don't have any to show you right now, but we did want to thank you with a gift and with a notebook and a little caddy with our logo on it. So I'll reach out to you to see how we can get that to you once we're back on campus. Thank you again.
Well, now the campus is open, I understand, you'll see me in the physical appearance manifestation sometime in the hallway relatively soon.
Okay, well, it'll be great to see you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And I just want to say in closing that I'm very grateful to Dr. Edwards for his leadership at the Humanities Center, because it is the global public square of Wayne State where everybody can come and present. And he is the most generous individual in making every single person that does a presentation looks like a great intellectual hero. So I really appreciate his kindness. Thank you.
All right, the check is in the mail. Thank you.
All right.
All right.
We'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.